Hey folks, we are so excited to join you today. It's really hard to follow what we just experienced. So maybe we all take a deep breath.
Yes.
Does anyone want to stand up a little? It's okay. We can stand up, shake it out a little bit, because that was quite an experience. And I'm so thankful to have experienced that storytelling and really the depth it takes to work in rare disease. And it's honestly an honor to be able to do the work that each one of us get to do each and every day. Today, we are going to talk about joining forces on another topic, not only keeping people living with rare diseases in the heart of everything that we do, but also the feelings of being forgotten, being unheard, being isolated, and being left behind. Now, I'm coming from the pharmaceutical industry where we've seen dazzling innovation. There are things I've seen in the last 5 years I don't think we would have ever dreamt of from an innovation perspective. But our innovation has outpaced health equity. So we have left people behind from different races, ethnicities, sexes, because different people react differently to our innovations, such as drugs, as well as medical products. Health disparities are persisting. We're leaving people behind at a much greater gap than I think we even recognize. The healthy from those in the underserved communities is getting greater. It seems so obvious, right? Like, we should be able to just include people that are in underrepresented groups. Just do it, right? No, it's not that simple. And I think our panelists today will talk about a lot of the complexities that we have about inclusion, making sure we're speaking the language, making sure we are approaching different communities with different approaches. I had the honor of seeing Martin Luther King III, and he was talking about some of the social determinants of health and gaps in our clinical trials. And one of that is, who do you trust to give you information? And that trust is essential in us understanding about ensuring we have much better diversity in our clinical trials so that the patients that are living with these diseases, we're actually serving the demographics of those diseases. Now, I've spoken to many folks about these topics, and I've seen it with my own eyes. The system that we've built does have good intent, but I will say the needle has not moved enough in terms of clinical trial diversity. I'm trained as a neuroscientist, so I am a card-carrying nerd. So I've got a little street cred up here. So what I'd like to say is that when I think about clinical trial diversity, it's much more about your mindset. And that mindset is about diversity and inclusion in our ways of working, how we operate, and how do we ingrain this in all levels of what we do to improve outcomes not only for the patient, but all patients. Capital, underline, bold, all. DE&I is really about ensuring that we improve those outcomes for all patients in all therapeutic areas. So when we talk about diversity, I'm talking about the multi-dimensions of diversity, thinking everything from ethnic diversity, race, sex, but also age. We talk about those with disabilities. We heard about that in the previous session. We talk about transgender. We talk about socioeconomic determinants of health. All of these lenses, this kaleidoscope, we need to use that when we're focusing on how best to design clinical trials to ensure that they are inclusive and they represent the demographics of the patients that we serve. And this can't be done in silos. So I'll be leveraging our incredible panel here today, which I'll take a moment to introduce. We have Richie Kahn. He's a co-founder of Canary Advisors. This organization partners with biopharma, nonprofit, regulatory stakeholders to better align clinical development with what patients actually want and need. Second panelist here, Starling is the CEO of Reveles, which is an equity-driven clinical research company committed to increasing representation and inclusion in clinical trials. And then from our clinical perspective, I have Dr. Tanvee Varma. She's a resident physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital whose research is on this very topic of clinical diversity. So, first question for my panelists today. What is the one most important insight you'd like the audience to remember or action on in terms of clinical diversity in our trials? What's working? What's not working? What do you see as effective strategies as we tackle the elephant in the room of lack of diversity in clinical trials? I'm going to first pass it over to Richie.
Yeah, so I would say we are making a lot of progress, right? The more we dialogue, the more we have conversation about this really important topic, better off we're going to be. This is a really timely conversation in light of the FDA guidance finally coming out about diversity action plans. I will say about 2 weeks later, there was another document that came out that I think was not as noted by the industry, right? There was another publication by the National Council on Disability that talked about how accessibility and disability is often left out of this conversation, right? So I would encourage everyone who is designing clinical trials, thinking about protocols that are inclusive to make sure that we're actually talking about accessibility as well.
Thanks, Richie. Orcas.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I think this topic is extremely timely, and I think particularly what's acute is this notion of trust or lack of trust or mistrust. And so one of those meaningful insights that we believe at Reveles is that trust is a decision. It's not an emotion. And so in order to present yourself to these communities and to ensure that you are trusted, you have to be trustworthy. And that starts with a theme that actually was characterized this morning and throughout some of the earlier discussions was this notion of sustained engagement. That's actually a part of the FDA guidance that was recently issued, is around sustained engagement, not being transactional when you're approaching traditionally underrepresented communities, and making sure that you are giving more than you're asking. And so these are proven strategies where we've seen, and certainly it's been demonstrative, that is when you're going into communities, when you're engaging underrepresented communities, is making sure you're presenting yourself as trustworthy. And that really does start with your intentions. That really does, it starts with the information that's being shared and making sure that you're there to ensure their best interest is being met. And again, your ask to give ratio should certainly be, certainly higher. I would even consider to give magnitude is to think about 5 to 1. You should be giving more than certainly than you're asking, and all of which of this is intended to help facilitate greater trust, which is again as a decision, not an emotion.
Thank you. And Tandy?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. The one takeaway I wanted to talk about was actually something, Kim, that you already kind of mentioned, which is that truly advancing clinical trial diversity is about making clinical trials accessible to all and really decreasing barriers to clinical trials. I'm sure many of you have either maybe tried to be in a clinical trial or know of someone that's tried to be in a clinical trial, and you'll know that participating in a clinical trial is just a lot of work and it's super challenging. First, you have to know that there's a clinical trial that you may be eligible for, and we know that there's so many clinical trial sites that are located around academic medical centers or in big cities, but there are really very few clinical trial sites in the community. And so many patients who may benefit from a clinical trial may not even know that there's one that they could be eligible for. So first you have to know about a clinical trial. Then when you maybe Google it, you find out that you may be eligible, there's a whole list of eligibility criteria. You have to have this creatinine, you have to have this liver function, and research now shows that a lot of these eligibility criteria are completely arbitrary. And they end up weeding out many patients, whether they're older, they're people of color. Many patients get weeded out by these eligibility criteria. And then maybe you're lucky enough to be eligible for the trial. The actual act of being in a trial is so much work. We know that patients often have to come in for lab draws on a regular basis. They have to be seen by the doctor on a regular basis. They have to get their medications. And it's such a tremendous amount of work that really, once you get through these few barriers, and I'm just naming a few of them, that it puts it, really the most privileged are the ones that are able to jump through all these hoops. And I think that really, there's always concern, especially with diversity action plans, that there'll be kind of tokenization of patients, that patients will be cherry-picked to meet these diversity quotas that are being set. But I think the people who are doing the work in clinical trial diversity are really actually pushing for making clinical trials accessible for all people and really decreasing the barriers to clinical trial. And so I think what I would want everyone to take away is really that's where we should be putting our attention, is about decreasing barriers to clinical trials.
So I love the point that you talked about this ability of cherry picking. So where does that come from? So that's data. I'll do a Marsha, data. So healthcare data, it's super rich. It's actually, we're in a community of healthcare being the most data-rich industry out of any in the world, which is incredible. That data can be then tailored, we can do patient finding. But what keeps me up at night a bit is about the safety of using AI. AI is great, but when it's put into the hands of someone that doesn't understand the algorithms, doesn't understand the data sources, and working in super small populations like rare diseases, you have to be careful with those things. And I think that's something that we're going to continue to look as Gen AI advances about overseeing this technology by the right experts and making sure the models have the right content as well as the right context. And a little bit more on data. So I want to share a couple of points that have recently come up in terms of some of the more recent publications. And by your resident nerd, and yes, I also love data, a couple facts. So Black or African American, as well as Hispanic populations, if we look at inclusion rates in our clinical trials, they're falling so far below the actual demographics of these populations in the US. And I have even worse news. It's getting worse. The last 5 years, the rate has dropped nearly in half for the number of Black and African Americans in clinical trials, as well as signals of decline in the Hispanic population. So not only are we trying to put more effort in, but that effort is not working. However, the FDA has seen this signal as well, which is really great. So in June, they passed a draft guidance for sponsors like myself and my peers to develop and submit diversity plans. So this is really exciting, but it's new, right? So we have to really think about the right strategies to employ from an industry perspective about having better communication to diverse populations, that trust that our guests talked about, that trust, it's earned, it's not given. And how do we have ways to combat some of the negative perceptions about drug interventions? I know we went through a lot with COVID and vaccinations. So there's a lot to do in terms of diversity. So, given the new guidance, what are your views on the Clinical Trial Diversity Plan initiative? And what are your thoughts? I'm going to start with Richie.
Yeah, I think it's much needed. So much of the way I think about clinical research is framed by my background in public health. And by that, I mean so many of the things that have been really sort of fundamental to building relationships with communities in public health. The last couple of years in clinical research, it's like the light bulb is coming on and people are going, yes, we need to proactively build long-term mutually beneficial relationships. It can't be transactional. We can't be reaching out to community leaders when there's a clinical trial coming up, right? So when I was still, prior to getting involved in clinical research, I was working in a nonprofit, the Hepatitis B Foundation. And we used to do a lot of work in the community. We were based in the Philadelphia area. And at the time, the populations in southeastern Pennsylvania that were most impacted by hepatitis B were Asian American Pacific Islanders and West African immigrants. And the prevalence of Hep B, like 10 to 15%, it was really, really high. And whether you're talking hepatitis B or hepatitis C, all these clinical trials are looking for patients who are treatment naive. Well, the only reason someone's treatment naive is because they haven't been diagnosed yet. They may well have had this condition for decades, they're not symptomatic yet. Now they're having maybe some routine blood work, something comes up. We wanted to get involved before that. We wanted to get involved in screening and linkages to care. So I remember, and I can't tell you why it's so clear in my mind, it's almost 15 years now, right? But we were getting ready to try to reach out to some community partners to get a screening set up. And we reached out to the pastor of this Korean American church, Holy Angels, in Northeast Philadelphia. And I remember several folks from Hep B Foundation went, they had a conversation after church, they sat there for the service, they got to know the minister, they spent some time talking about the importance of Hep B and screening and linkage to care in this community. And the minister just kind of went, come back in 3 weeks, 10 a.m. So we did, we came back at 9:45 with coffee and donuts. This was between services. I think there was a line of 300 congregants waiting for their screening, right? They had been informed about the screening. They had some knowledge sharing from their pastor, someone they trusted, who said, look, we don't want to just get a diagnosis. The Hepatitis B Foundation has doctors in the community, local, they speak Korean if you're not comfortable speaking English. They're in your neighborhood. They know some of the concerns you have, right? Just sort of building those inroads to the community, not simply coming in and say, look, here's what we did for this grant, now fund us again for next year, right? And that was just one step in this long-term, mutually beneficial approach to building that relationship, to building bridges, and they have a number of partners who do work in clinical trials, right? So I'm sure there are opportunities there to talk about clinical research as a care option, what to know, what's being done to keep you safe, and how next time you go to the pharmacy, it's always mind-blowing when you look around at the pharmacy shelves to realize not possible without trials, and trials aren't possible without patients. So more conversations like that will ultimately behoove everybody and go a long way.
And it's going to take us all. I mean, it revolves around a local community ecosystem of care approach. And I think we're going to have to think about things very differently when we think about how we will recruit, and not even recruit, but awareness even prior to diagnosis. So I'm going to pass it to Arques. Give me some of your thoughts about this draft guidance.
I'm just curious. I know it's a little bit off script. Has anyone, by show of hands, has anyone read the draft guidance? Has anyone?
I mean,
just
you get to read all of this.
We're gonna see.
Super great.
Took some notes.
It's like 90 pages
Regulatory.
long. Okay, all right. So maybe
we'll give a little background.
Okay, all right. Well, the actual guidance has actually been updated a few times, and I think last Thursday or this week was the deadline to comment. But one of the things that was pronounced in terms of the frameworks in developing the diversity action plans, which I overwhelmingly support, is that we do need a little bit of a reinforcement in terms of ensuring that sponsors, and as well as device companies as well, because it extends both to device companies, is that we're actually intentionally thinking about how we engage, how do we ensure the data is representative, how we ensure that those that are participating in biomedical research truly reflect the population in which you intend to treat. And the approaches are described in terms of thinking about your workforce, so beginning to encourage sponsors to think about their principal investigators, the distribution of their sites. As Dr. Varma said, we talked about largely and historically, most of the trials have been around academic research, these kind of monolithic, the big 50 or so sites. But it's really encouraging sponsors to think differently and to really engage community-based sites that are actually in diverse communities, by which We know that these are proven, and again, very demonstrative methods to ensure that we are engaging folks in that community. So looking at your workforce, looking at the distribution of the clinical trial workforce, again, engaging, whether it's principal investigators, sub-Is, looking at site feasibility in the communities, ensuring that that you're starting to engage more than just your traditional academic research sites. Those are some of the components that the action plans are really enforcing. The other thing that I will say is, again, looking at novel approaches such as decentralized clinical trial approaches, really began to think about how do you incorporate things such as technology, ePro, eCOA, telehealth, and not only the actual technology approaches, but also thinking about how do you leverage third-party vendors such as nurses, mobile phlebotomists to go in and really do some of those barriers. A lot of the clinical procedures for these studies can be done. They can be done safely, they can be done effectively, and they can be done in a way that ensures that there is integrity around the data. And so looking at these approaches and really thinking about how do you incorporate these approaches into your protocol design. So I am someone who is working very closely with sponsors to think about how do they begin to craft these diversity action plans. But I think as an industry, like what we learned with COVID, is beginning to share best practices. We saw firsthand what we can do in a matter of 10, 12 months in terms of being able to just the industry-wide collaboration and sharing. We can do that. We can do that by being able to share more broadly about how we approach these diversity action plans and ensuring that everyone has, kind of a best practices and a playbook, if you allow me.
I love it. And to me, the strategies that we have to think about are across all of those layers. And when we hear that we need better diversity amongst the physicians, that's a whole nother change, right? We have a shortage in terms of physicians in the US, and then ensuring that those populations are more diverse. Locations. We've got to get out of the ivory tower and bring trials into your home, and the technology exists. So there's a lot of work that we need to be doing. Dr. Varma, I'm gonna have you give some comments on the guidance as well.
Sure, I totally agree with everything that everyone has already said. So explicitly, the Diversity Action Plan requires sponsors, when they apply for new drug approval, to say what they want their enrollment goals to be. So like, what % of their trial participants should be older adults? What % are gonna be Black, Hispanic, et cetera? And then explicitly write out the strategies that they're going to do to try to achieve those goals. And so I think, as already mentioned, it's great that this is a true tangible thing. I think for many years, the FDA has encouraged diversity in clinical trials, but I think this is the first time that the FDA is requiring that sponsors address diversity. I think there are definitely, though, still a few gaps. So one that we've been thinking about is, how is success and failure going to be determined? So for example, if a sponsor says that they want to recruit 20% of their participants to be Black, for example, if they're only 15%, is that success? Is that failure? It's unclear kind of how the FDA is going to take a stance on that. And then if the FDA, for example, determines that this is actually a failure on the sponsor's part not to meet their goal, are there any consequences to failing? So Congress gave the FDA authority to require diversity action plans, but it did not give the FDA the authority to kind of punish or truly punish sponsors for not meeting those plans. And so there's a concern that really it's going to be maybe a small, slap on the wrist, and then sponsors will continue to move on. And then another thing, as a researcher, I'm always thinking about, what will I as a researcher have access to, right? And so unfortunately, although the FDA encouraged sponsors to make their diversity action plans publicly available, it has not required it. Mm-hmm. Which makes it difficult because, we think it's all a great proposal, these diversity action plans, but who's going to be able to actually study it? And so I think the fact that they're not publicly available makes it harder for us as the public to hold the FDA and sponsors accountable. And also the FDA's feedback on these diversity action plans is not going to be made publicly available, as we know. And then the last point I wanted to make, and this is really to Richie's point, is that the diversity action plan only requires enrollment goals on very specific variables, and that's sex, age, race, and ethnicity. And that's a very limited view of diversity. I think, it encourages data collection on and setting goals based on socioeconomic status and other variables, but it doesn't explicitly require it, which I think is really a limiting thing.
Thank you. I think there is going to be a double-edged sword as we go through this. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of learning. And it's a bit of an ethical responsibility on the sponsor side to ensure we have a commitment. We have a commitment to make sure that we are serving the entire population of the therapeutic areas that we are working in. And that's something from an ethical perspective, we've got to look really hard in the mirror and ensure that we are serving all patients when we are conducting these clinical trials. Now, I have the beauty of having a beautiful, diverse panel here. So I'm going to ask a little bit of questions given your specific background. So Richie, clearly you have some strong views in terms of being a patient advocate, but from the patient advocacy side and pushing it through that lens of clinical trial diversity, what are some of the views that you can share with the audience? Because it may not be a topic that we all talk about at the dinner table, to be honest. So what are some of the things that we should take away?
Yeah, so talking about the advocacy lens, everyone contains multitudes, right? Clinical researcher for 15 years. I used to work in health technology where they get really excited about bringing trials to your home and wearables and devices. And I was always the guy going, well, yeah, but number one, does everyone have high-speed internet? Mm-hmm. And even if they do, we really can't overestimate the importance of a real-life human connection, right? So you want to reduce the likelihood people are going to drop out of a trial. Have someone actually build a connection who cares about that person, right? I used to work in patient recruitment and retention, and I remember sharing an almost cost-free solution with somebody for building these relationships, engaging patients. Listen actively, note when someone has, a big trip or a birthday coming up, send them a birthday card every year, right? So making sure you understand that if you're a coordinator, you're an investigator, you're a sub-investigator, you are building awareness of clinical research as a care option, you are often educating, you are building inroads into the community, and you are a representative of the broader industry. Really be mindful of that and take the time to build these relationships thoughtfully. And I would also not encourage anyone to underestimate the importance of swag for trials. Right? Whether it's a tote bag, a hat, an umbrella, you'd be surprised how many people go to the grocery store, they're bagging something. They either have this reusable bag or a cool hat, and, maybe Kim goes, well, where'd you get that cool bag? Kim doesn't know anything about research, isn't interested in participating, but Dr. Varma's had a really good experience. She goes, well, let me tell you. I'm involved in this really cool thing called clinical research where I get to contribute to science, and they treat me like a VIP, which I am. And there's also this cool branded swag, right? She is now spreading the gospel of clinical research in the community, person to person. So you can never underestimate the importance of personalizing the relationship there, right?
That's huge, because I think about some of the things that typically motivate someone to volunteer for a clinical trial is because you often get an elevation of your clinical care. Mm-hmm. You're spending more time with your physician or allied healthcare professionals. So in a decentralized model, it is something we have to really watch carefully. Are we creating that support, the bond, the motivation for contributing to the science?
And Kim, the one thing I would add to that, when we talk about decentralization and bringing tests to your home, that's great, but I would also always encourage flexibility whenever possible, right? I remember talking to a number of patients in the sickle cell community, and we were talking about home nursing. And a couple different patients made the point, look, if I'm not feeling well enough to travel, I'm not feeling well enough to take care of my house, I don't want some stranger in there judging me because my house is dirty right now. So we have to be thoughtful about how we create that flexibility in the protocol for optionality.
Yeah, that's huge, because you think of many of the disease states that we even talk about in this room over the past week. Ableism. Yeah. So do you want someone with you in your home That's a whole nother barrier for us to think about. So appreciate that. Maybe switching gears a bit to RCAS. I know you have a bit of a personal story to talk about how you funded Reveles, or founded, excuse me, Reveles, and the importance of being able to actually engage individuals working in clinical trials. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, happy to. The origin story for Reveles is deeply personal, and quite frankly, it's a little bit spiritual for me. And the company was founded after the convergence of both a professional as well as personal experience. My mother was diagnosed with a rare lung disorder. We spent a little bit over 3.5 years, which again, in the rare disease space now is actually a very accelerated timeline, but we actually received the diagnosis. She was having reoccurring flu-like illness, non-productive cough, and we went, I believe, to 6 or 7 specialists, and that whole process in itself was just a learning experience, particularly because I am trained as a pharmacist. I've actually spent nearly 20 years running large-scale specialty pharmacies. I've worked across therapeutic areas such as chronic kidney disease, hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, and oncology. And here I was, really not able to help my mother throughout that process, and quite frankly found it as a healthcare professional and executive that it was very cumbersome. One of the things that was very profound was through all of that process, there was really no discussion of clinical research, even though we were chasing answers, but it was never a part of the actual, essentially discussion. But when it dawned on me that my mother, who was open and trusted me, when I introduced the ideal of finding hope in a clinical trial, she was incredibly receptive. We moved past conversations about being a guinea pig. We moved past conversations about the lack of mistrust, historical mistrust that she lived through and had a very firsthand knowledge of some of those atrocities. And here we were. And so that whole experience really, quite frankly, frustrated me and really pissed me off. And so Reveles was born. So my company is essentially a company that's pioneering the future of healthcare engagement. We launched really focusing on bringing clinical trials to patients by providing decentralized clinical trial solutions. And so this is, over the last 4.5 years, I've made it my work, my body of work to ensure that all patients have access to clinical trials and that are aware. Not only do you need to be, clinical trials need to be accessible, but people need to be aware. And one of the really acute things to me is that when my mother was going through her whole process and we learned about a clinical trial, however, that trial was actually in the Northeast. The nearest site was in the Northeast. We are in the Texas southwestern area. She said something that was profound that I just really didn't understand, but ended up being quite remarkable, was that the clinical trial was available, yet she didn't have access. And so there are millions of patients, there are millions of clinical trials that are available, but most patients do not have access. So being very mindful about the distinction between what's available and what people have access to. And then more importantly, making sure that we have mechanisms to bring awareness to why one would want to give themselves to science, why we want to be a partner in science and biomedical research. Has been something that has been, quite frankly, a very uplifting journey for me. And it's great that I'm reminded every day that I get to hop out of bed. When my feet hit the ground, I'm doing a very purposeful work, and it was really started by my mother.
That's incredible. And I love what you were saying, and it's something that we need to reflect on is just because a clinical trial is available doesn't mean that I can access it. And that's something that has to be part of these clinical diversity plans in our clinical trials. Maybe switching gears a bit. So Dr. Varma, I am beyond impressed with your publication in the BMJ, which is also British Medical Journal, very high-ranking clinical journal. I would love for you to tell us a bit about some of your research in clinical trial diversity, as well as your ranking system.
Yeah, sure. So as mentioned, my research is predominantly in clinical trial diversity. And so some of the work I do is on the kind of ethical implications of clinical trial diversity. Kind of the second bucket I would say is kind of what is the state of clinical trial diversity? And like you said, Kim, it's not looking good. It's gotten only worse with time, or at least it's about the same. And then the third bucket, which I think is the most exciting, is what do we actually do about it? And so what we found is that in other industries, ranking companies that whose behavior you want to change actually works. And so what that does is that it allows the public to compare companies to each other and actually sometimes even change their own investment strategies in those companies. But also companies are incentivized to change their behaviors based off of their rankings. And so what we did was, my mentor, Jen Miller, she's founded a nonprofit called Bioethics International that specifically tries to improve the behaviors of pharmaceutical companies. And what we did was we developed the Good Pharma Scorecard specifically for diversity. And so what we did was we developed a measure called the Fair Inclusion Measure and ranked sponsors based off of the clinical trial diversity of their sponsored clinical trials. And so our Fair Inclusion Measure includes two different variables. It includes data transparency and representation. And so data transparency is really about, if I Google a trial, am I able to actually see at the number of women, older adults, and racial and ethnic minorities that participated in that trial? And surprisingly, that's kind of difficult to find for a lot of different trials. And so we ranked companies according to that variable. And then the second is, once we have that data, how representative are the trials? And that combination of the two variables, creates the Fair Inclusion Measure. And so what we found was that, there's actually quite a wide-ranging set of scores for companies that we would actually consider kind of similar. And so that's good because, one fear that we had is like, what if everyone scores 100%? And obviously that wasn't the case. And then what we found was that companies really cared about their score, which is kind of the whole premise of this. And so we got a lot of good feedback about the measure, but we also got a lot of good questions like, why did I score this low? What can I do next time to change my score? And so that really kind of proved to us that there was kind of merit in this concept. And we've gotten a lot of great feedback that we're going to now incorporate to our next set of scores. So what we did as our pilot was we looked at oncologic therapeutics that were approved between 2012 and 2017, which is pretty dated. But our next set of scores is coming out pretty soon, which we're excited to share. But it was really meaningful to be able to actually, come up or think about actual solutions to this problem. Because I think, as a researcher who might be sitting in her ivory tower, there's a lot of, it's very easy for us to kind of pontificate about these issues. But actually trying to come up with something tangible was incredibly meaningful.
That's incredible. And it's a good mirror as a sponsor to hold up.
Yeah, exactly.
To say, how am I doing?
Right.
And to have someone objectively say, well, actually, you're not doing
Not
so
great.
great. or guess what? You made a little bit of progress. And here's the things that we can do. So that level of collaboration is really, really important. We're starting to get close to time. I'm going to ask the panelists one last question. So if I were your fairy godmother and I can grant you a wish, what is one wish you have for clinical trial diversity? And I'll let you go. We're going to go popcorn style. So I will let whoever is ready for their wish to give that out.
I'll go.
Okay.
If I had a wish, I feel like I want to close my eyes.
You can. It's okay.
I feel like I want to close my eyes and maybe, blow out a candle or something. One of the things that I wish, and I want to get to a place where that we're not talking about diversity in clinical trials in a manner which is problematic. I want to get to a place, and I wish that we talk about clinical trials and the need for more inclusive research synonymous was like, we don't talk about why we need water and oxygen to live. That would be my wish. It's because it's necessary. It's necessary. My wish would be, hey, it's necessary. I'll go a little bit further to say I had a conversation with the leader of an emerging biotech company, and it was profound. The vice president of clinical operation told me that I'm not thinking about diversity because all I'm trying to get through is my phase 1, phase 2. And what was really profound was she was like, I'll let somebody else deal with that. I had never, ever thought that companies have perceptions about diversity as it's a brake as opposed to a gas pedal. And that when we're engaging emerging companies, that they're seeing diversity as something that slows down their clinical development. And going back to my wish, I wish we would see it's necessary, that it's not a break. And if it's done right, it can truly be incredibly advantageous for the commercialization efforts of your product.
Thank you, Arkas. Other thoughts from the group?
If I had one wish about diversity in clinical trials, we would already be at a place where clinical research is generalizable to the broader population. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think kind of a similar point. If I had a wish, I think I would hope that clinical trials were just part of the day-to-day life for a patient. That it's something that they could easily enter and exit, that they, on the day-to-day as a physician in particular, interacting with patients, that I could feel like many of my patients were in clinical trials and they saw it as something that was easy for them to do, something that was exciting because they were able to contribute to science in their community. And it wasn't such an onerous, challenging thing for patients to do.
Thank you. So necessary, generalized, and integrated is in terms of our approach. We clearly have a lot of work to do. I want to say a huge thank you to the incredible panelists that I got to sit with today. And I think the clock's up, so let's give a round of applause to Richie, Arkas, and Tanvee.